Hey class, I hope you've settled in quite well over the last couple of weeks, getting used to the online classroom. Today I'm going to just do a brief presentation for you covering early India. So we refer to this geographical region as South Asia. We know it primarily as the area of India. So I'm starting first with the Indus Valley. It's the Indus River Valley. And you have the Indus River and other key rivers here coming down from the Himalayas. And the two sites that have been excavated and investigated the most are Harappa. You can see that there if you're following my icon. And Mohenjo-daro. Interestingly, much of what we see here in the early era, we actually will see later on in India as well. I want to start out and mention that in Mohenjo-daro there was a city, and although your book says that some of the structures here may be religious in nature, ultimately we really truly do not have complete full-on evidence of either royal palaces or religious temples. The structures were many of the structures were apartment buildings. Sometimes they were 2 stories. They had plumbing systems and actually latrines as well. There was a great bath, and this is one of the notable areas that has been reconstructed in this ancient city. And you might notice the date here. The Mohenjo-daro era ranges from about 2600 to 1900 BCE. And as you learned last week, BCE refers to before the Common Era. We might have used it for a long time just saying BC, if you recall. Anyway, this is the Great Bath. It is thought that there may have been ritual bathing here, and that's just because we're working backwards. Ritual bathing is still a key aspect of India today. Here are some images of the latrines, which would take the dirty water and get it out of the city and drain away from the clean water or the plumbing that they had in their homes. We also know that the people in this area traded, and it's interesting to think about that. Eventually, today we're going to learn about the Silk Road a little bit, and the Silk Road was a trading route. And so trade begins early on with the Indus River Valley of Mohenjo-daro and the Harappan civilizations. Here you see jewelry. These are coming from areas outside the region. These are stones that come from outside the region. Another interesting part of the works of art that survive, or really they were utilitarian, we consider them works of art today, are these stamp seals. And then you can see what that impression looks like. So the left image is a little seal, little stamp, basically. It's about 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches, so it's very small. There'd be a knob on the back of it. Somebody could wear it around their neck. And this was thought to have stamped packages that carried goods, perhaps along a trading route. There is a writing system. You might notice those interesting shapes up top. It is undeciphered, so as of this moment, we do not have a deciphered writing system from this culture. There are other stamp seals with seated male figures. This is the one shown in your book. You can see that the face has 3 faces, but otherwise it's fairly plain outside the writing. I'm going to show you a little bit more complicated one. This one I think is actually the work of art your book might be referring to, only because this one shows animals, and your book does talk about this stamp seal with animals. Here you see a man seated in a yogic posture. He has 3 faces and a horn headdress. You also see various animals around him. Later on, when we discuss images of Buddha or Prince Siddhartha Gautama, who is our historical Buddha, you will notice he is often depicted in this same position, and that he often has deer depicted with him as well. Deer, his first sermon was in a deer park, and that's the connection with deer. In the female sculptures, this one is just simply titled Figurine of a Mother Goddess. We have no idea if this is a goddess. It might be a political ruler. It might be a representation of somebody in society. This is something we don't know. So this is an era where we don't have a writing system that we can rely on, so we have to make guesses as to what we're looking at. And here, one thing I want to point out is the sensual body that you see, the curving body. This is a depiction of a female that we will see continually throughout our discussions on India. They also have depicted a torso of a priest king. Now, ultimately, again, we have no idea if this is a priest or a religious practitioner or a king, like a ruler. Those are things we don't know. We assume he is somebody of note due to the ornamentation. You see around his forehead, there's a band with a little circle that is also echoed in that armband that you see. What I would like to point out is that trefoil shape, that three-lobed shape that you see on his garment over the shoulder. That is a symbol or a design that actually comes from Sumeria, which is the ancient Near East. We don't discuss Sumeria in this class, but if you've taken an ancient Western art history class at some point, you discussed the Sumerians. This is an example of that trefoil or three-lobe design from a Sumerian artwork, actually a bull. So when we see this back in Sumeria in 3000 BCE, and we see it repeated here in Mohenjo-Daro, it tells us that influence from Sumeria made its way into India. Of course, we don't know that for sure. This is how we piece together these early eras of art. Then we move into something called the Vedic period. And by the way, just so you know, I am going over this information quite quickly today. You can stop at any time, go back, read the book, fill in with the book. The Vedic period is discussed heavily in the book. But I just want to give you guys it's almost like a presentation of an outline of things you should be focusing on and paying attention to in this particular presentation. So the Vedic period dates from the time when the Aryans, otherwise known as either the noble ones, I've seen it also referred to as the knowledgeable ones, they composed the Vedas. And these are basically revelations from Brahman, who is the supreme universal spirit. It includes prayers and offerings and how to go about participating in sacrifices. There's also other useful information like society and the castes in society, and India still works with the caste system. So Brahmin, supreme universal spirit, Brahmin, with an I in that second syllable, are priests, and they're the only ones who had contact with deities. Now check this out. Brahmins would offer sacrifices to Brahman, and those sacrifices would be things like a milk-like drink called soma, and wealthy individuals would be able to afford to offer things for sacrifice in like a fire sacrifice. And this got to be to the point where, of course, those who were wealthy then were favored by the god because they were able to provide a sacrifice. So this leads, and I'm simplifying this by the way, but for our class it's fine. And this leads then to the Brahmins or the priests who reform the Vedic ritual. So they basically rewrite the Vedas. And this period and these new texts are called Upanishads. I've also heard that pronounced Upanishads. So a couple of different pronunciations there. Hinduism, which we'll discuss next week, really revolves from the Vedic tradition. Jainism, or the Jains, and the Buddhist religions were most successful, but the thing is they didn't think the Brahmins were of authority. So you'll learn a little bit more about Buddhism this week. That's the focus. This week is Buddhism. Themes that continued from the Upanishads to the present time are things like samsara. Samsara is important to note. You're going to come across this word a lot in your reading. It's the endless birth, suffering, and rebirth that it is believed people went through. Dharma and karma are like moral laws or how you live on earth, and they dictate how your life will be in the next life. So the belief is in a rebirth. And if you achieve enlightenment and you are free from that merry-go-round of birth, suffering, death, and rebirth, we call that nirvana. Moksha is what it's called in Hinduism, but you can just understand it as nirvana. That's what should clarify that for you. Some of you guys may have played when you were younger chutes and ladders. That's where you spin and you go up a certain number of steps, but if you land on the wrong little square, you end up having to take a chute all the way down, or you can climb up the ladder. That actually developed in India, and it's based on this idea of samsara, the endless round of birth and rebirth. Birth, suffering, death, rebirth. Okay? They called it snakes and ladders. And so if you are a really bad person, if you had bad karma in your life, you might be reborn in the next life as a snake. But if you had good karma, you might be born a higher being in society. And the goal in Buddhism is to get off that merry-go-round and to achieve enlightenment. So let's talk about Buddhism. You can read about Prince Siddhartha Gautama in your textbook. He became known as Buddha. Now, Buddha is not a god. Buddha simply means the enlightened one. So Prince Siddhartha Gautama is simply enlightened. He said that enlightenment could be achieved not through priests like the Brahmins, but through the Four Noble Truths. So again, he's removing the priests out of the religion, and an individual on their own can achieve enlightenment. And so in Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths are life is suffering, reason for suffering is desire, freedom from suffering is the end of desire, and path to this freedom is called the middle way. It negotiates between extreme self-indulgence and self-mortification. So it's sort of, that idea of not doing anything too extreme. And there's an eightfold path, which are additional rules to follow in order to follow the middle way. Prince Siddhartha Gautama was a prince. He was locked up by his father due to a prophecy. He escaped. He saw sick people. He saw elderly people. He saw dying people, and he wanted to investigate what suffering of this world was about. So he actually escaped from his palace where he had everything he could ever desire, and that is where he went on the spiritual path. He meditated, and after a number of years meditating, he became enlightened, and then he started to preach what he learned. So that's the basics of Buddhism. I'm giving you guys real basics here today. The next period I want to discuss is the Maurya period. And we're still in the BCE, or before the Common Era. And specifically, I want to talk about Ashoka. Ashoka was a ruler who ruled, and he was ruling by conquest, and he was taking armies down the coast of India and conquering and killing many people. But he saw the death and destruction that this caused, and he ended up really following the way of the Buddha. And he then starts to erect columns all over his land. He unified much of India, and these columns are both functional and symbolic. So there are edicts written on them. Edicts are like rules, and they link Buddhism with politics. So this political ruler is placing these edicts, these columns that you see here, all over his lands that he unified in India, and basically telling people as a political ruler that this is how you should live your life, and he's pulling on and working towards Buddhism. It's also symbolic. It acts like the axis mundi, which connects the heavens to the earth. On top of these columns, you'll often see animals such as a lion. A lion is associated both with the ruling class, but a lion is also associated with Prince Siddhartha Gautama. It is said that when he completed his first sermon, he sounded like the roar of a lion. So there again, the lion is political and religious in nature. So here's another image of one of the lion capitals that would have been on top of a column erected by Ashoka. Now, last week you learned about iconography. Iconography is the study of symbols. And so I want to talk about the symbol of the chakra. The chakra is the shape of the wheel, and you can see that here. And the chakra, or the wheel, is associated with Buddha's first sermon, which has been described as turning the wheel of the law for the first time. Now, a wheel also can connect to a political ruler because it could mean that that ruler could go anywhere he wanted, right? He could take his chariot anywhere he wanted to go in any region. So the wheel is interesting because it has this religious connotation, especially is what we see in connection with Buddhism, and the turning the wheel of the law, which was the first sermon by Buddha. But it also has a political connotation that the ruler can go anywhere. This is especially true during Ashoka's period. The Great Stupa was also built during this Maurya dynasty. This is really a place for pilgrims to come and remember Prince Siddhartha Gautama. So when Prince Siddhartha Gautama died, his body was cremated and split up into several parts. Over time, it was split up into, they say, about 84,000 parts. So a stupa like this would house some part of those cremated remains of the historical Buddha, who is Prince Siddhartha Gautama. There are these entrances, north, south, east, west. We're looking at one of those entrances, and we call these toranas. They're like gates. Once you're inside these gates, you circumambulate, meaning you walk around the stupa. While walking around the stupa, you act sort of like a celestial being traversing around the universe. On these toranas, you see that there's some sculptural reliefs. Reliefs, as you learned last week, are images that project from the background, but they are not fully freestanding. And these images there are all kinds of different images on here. Now, Jataka tales are tales about stories of Buddha's previous lives. So Buddha had, it is said, 550 lives. So our historical Buddha, Prince Siddhartha Gautama, had lived 550 times until he achieved enlightenment. And so there are these tales on how he died in each of those lives, or the way he lived in those lives. So in this Jataka tale, it's called the Monkey King, where this monkey king was king of the other monkeys. And then there was a human king who came to his region and wanted to eat his mango tree. And then when he noticed the monkeys, the king said, hey man, now that we're eating mangoes, tomorrow we're going to have monkeys with our mangoes. And the plan was that the human army was going to kill the monkeys. And in the Monkey King story, the monkey stretches across the river, as you can see up here at the very top of this image. Here, the monkey stretches across the river, and he tells his monkey followers to jump on his back to get across to the other side. One of the monkey enemies jumped on the Monkey King's back, hurt him, and eventually killed him. Now, the ending of that story is different in different tellings of this story. Jataka tales are very popular with children, so sometimes ending with, and then he dies, as you might hear me say if I'm in lecture, because at the end of the day, he dies. That's his life, his previous life, and then he goes on and lives another life. Sometimes if you hear some of these stories, they're told slightly differently. They're interpreted slightly differently, or they're a little softer in tone, for example, with children. But these are great stories. By the way, there is no one book or no one place to go learn about Buddha. Okay? It's not like in Christianity where you have the Old Testament or the New Testament, right? So understand that there's no one text. Now, there are texts that you can go to learn bits and pieces, but there's no one book, right? Buddhism isn't like a religion of the book like Christianity is. This is another part from one of the Tirana gateways at Sanchi. Here we see basically the story of Buddha. Over here on the left-hand side is Buddha in his palace. That's a representation of his palace. There are also depictions of Buddha leaving his palace, right? This is where he leaves in the story to go find out what causes suffering in the world. But you'll never see Buddha. You'll see these parasols. There's a parasol, there's a parasol, and here's a horse. So, the idea is Buddha should be seated here on the horse, but he's not. Again, you see another parasol and the horse who's saddled here. This is called aniconic, or without image. At this time, so this is the 1st century BCE, at this time it was deemed inappropriate to create depictions of Buddha. So we do not see Buddha in human form. He is symbolized by having a parasol or the horse, or over here on the left-hand side, you see these feet. That is also a depiction of Buddha. But we don't actually see Buddha in human form. Also depicted on the Taranas are what we call yakshi figures. This is a yakshi figure. It's a female figure hanging from a mango tree. It looks like she's nude. She's actually clothed. You can see the hem of her dress right there. Her left leg bends, hits the trunk of a tree. Don't get confused, there's also a trunk of an elephant. And that creates the flowering and vegetation of the mango tree. Of course, you'll notice that sensuality, just like what we saw in the Mohenjo-Daro region, you see that shapely sensuality of the female figure. And so in this case, what we're seeing is really aspects of fertility. So fertility is shown through her body, vegetation, you can see in the tree, and then, of course, because she's on the entrance to the gateway to the stupa, you can see the stupa in the background here, she also offers protection to those who are arriving and here visiting. So there you can see her depiction over here on the right-hand side, offering protection. Okay, I'm going to move on now and talk about the Kushan era. The Kushan was a major ruling dynasty after the Maurya. There are a couple other ones there, but I'm jumping to the Kushan, and specifically I'm going to discuss King Kanishka. King Kanishka ruled this region in northern India. This is very important, guys. One area in general, we say Gandhara. That's this area here. And the other area is Mathura. This is the capital city. So this is really where a lot of parts of life, were administrated from government and the society, etc., etc. In this northern region where we have Gandhar, we have the Silk Road. The Silk Road connects from essentially way over in the Mediterranean Sea, like where Greece and Rome is, and it actually comes through here and goes to China eventually. And we're going to learn more about the end of the Silk Road in China and these influences as well. But for now, I want you to know that the Silk Road comes from Greco-Roman world, Greece and Rome, the Mediterranean, and it cuts through this area, Gandhar. Okay? It's important to understand that. King Kanishka is a foreigner in India. He's ruling in India as a foreigner. He comes from Central Asia. The clothing he wears in this sculpture, even though his head is missing, you see a heavy coat that he wears, and then also these heavy felt boots. And there's also an inscription on here that says, King Kanishka, King of Kings. And so he's basically saying he's king of kings. He's ruling this region of India that I just pointed out, but he's a foreigner. He comes from Central Asia. So he comes from like the area of China. Okay. So that's sort of interesting. But him being a foreigner in India and ruling is fascinating because he accepts people with different ideas and different religions. So here's King Kanishka's coin, one of them. And over here on the left-hand side, you see sort of that familiar shape of the boots and the coat that he wears. But on the back side, he has a Greco-Roman deity. The Greeks and the Romans were polytheistic and they believed in multiple deities, right? But what this does is it leads to one of the very first depictions of Buddha. Again, here we see King Kanishka in his notable dress. And then on this side, we see Buddha. It's in the form of a human. Okay? So with tolerance, with acceptance, you start to see foreign ideas increase. And with that, a flowering of art. So this is important. To me, I think this is super important. With more tolerance and acceptance with people of different ideas and opinions, the more art, culture, and life flourishes. And we see this, for example, with King Kanishka. So now we move into an era where we actually have images of Buddha. And we're going to be looking at them and the differences between them from Gandhar and Mathura. Okay? Again, those two regions that I mentioned earlier. I'm going to start in Mathura, that capital city. And this is where we see Buddha start to take shape. in a very formal format. There's a little bit of an abstract quality, so abstract is one of those style terms, to the way the robes hang over here. There's sort of just lines, and he's dressed like in he's dressed in monk's robes over one shoulder. But the lines of the robes don't really reflect a natural draping of the robes. Also, even here, you see the hem of the robe and more of a sort of abstract depiction of the way robes are folded. You might notice some attendants on either side of him. There are attendants down here. There are lions. I already mentioned the connection with the lion. And then the wheel. Again, that idea of his first sermon. Now, there are symbols connected with Buddha, and there are 32 specific symbols. We won't see them all in all the sculptures we look at, so I'm going to focus on the most important ones. So let me just show you these depictions. First one I want to point out is called the Ushnisha. This is a symbol of enlightenment. It's the cranial bump. Then we have the Urna, which is the symbol of divine wisdom. This is often shown as either a dot on the forehead or a little swirl of hair. The next symbol that we will see quite often is these elongated ears but without earrings. What that means is he was once a prince, which elongated his ears, but now he has no earrings because he has renounced worldly goods, so he just has the earlobe that is elongated. So that tells us he has achieved enlightenment because he's not desiring to wear jewelry, for example. There is also often seen the chakra or the wheel of law. You can see it on his feet and hands. Not always. Sometimes we don't see the feet and hands, but you'll notice the chakra on the feet and hands. And then last, this isn't necessarily a symbol. They're hand gestures. It's called mudras. These are hand gestures. Again, not necessarily a symbol, but each gesture symbolizes something. And I think in your textbook there should be a couple of mudras. You'll often see a fear not mudra, a come forward mudra, a meditation mudra, for example. So you can take a look at those. Here's another Buddha statue from that capital city of Mathura. Again, you see it looks like he's wearing monk's robes, and it's quite abstract over here on the right with its striping. Of course, you see the Ushnisha, you see the Urna, you see the elongated ears, you see the chakra on the hands, you see the chakra on the feet as well. And this gesture, this mudra that he currently has his hand in is a fear not mudra. So that means fear not. Now, I want to talk about this region that's farther north. Again, I mentioned it already a couple of times. Gandhar, Silk Road comes through here. So with that, we have influence from Greece and Rome. And if you've ever taken any sort of a Western art history class that dealt with Greece and Rome, you might look at this sculpture instantly and say, wow, that drapery looks a lot like Greco-Roman drapery. So you literally see stylistic and artistic influences coming from some of the greatest Western cultures, ancient Greece and ancient Rome, here in northern India under King Kanishka, under his era. So we see great influence of Greece and Rome. Of course, you'll see those symbols we mentioned already, right? You're probably already looking at them since you're thinking about it. The Usnisha, the bump on the head, Urna, the mark on the forehead, and of course the elongated ears. Now check out this one. Oh, I should do this comparison. So here's the comparison between Mathura, you see on the left, that's that capital city, and then Gandhar, which is the area that the Silk Road goes through. So there's quite a bit of stylistic difference there. This figure on the right-hand side from Gandhar is a little bit more idealized. Again, that's an artistic style term. He looks perfect. Everything is perfectly placed. Even that hair is like there isn't a hair out of place, right? Here's another one. Now, if you guys saw this, you would most definitely probably not instantly think of Buddha. If you've had a Western art history class, you might think he looks like a Roman god or a Roman figure. He is standing in something called contrapposto. You can stand up and do it right next to your desk if you're listening to this. You'll see he's standing with one leg straight and the other leg is bent. This is how real human beings stand. We call that contrapposto, and it was invented in Greece. And here again, we see something that is like the quintessential symbol of the classical world used here in this particular statue. Here's another one to show you the contrapposto stance and the drapery as well. This is an ancient Greek sculpture just to show you what contrapposto looks like. So straight leg and the other leg is bent. So hopefully you're standing next to your desk and standing like this. It's quite natural. It's how we actually stand in our world. Now, if I showed you this image, you would notice the contrapposto stance. You might also say, hey, I see, I don't know exactly, but it looks like there might be something akin to that cranial bump or the usnesia. You might notice a mark on the forehead. The earrings here are elongating ears. So what this statue is, with the jewelry, sometimes he wears a headdress. This is called a bodhisattva. There's the name of it right there. A bodhisattva is basically somebody who's achieved enlightenment but prefers to stay in this world to help others. So we call this figure, we would technically say that's a Buddha of the future, because once he's helped others achieve enlightenment, he will then step over to Buddhahood. We call that Maitreya, the Bodhisattva Maitreya. Bodhisattva Maitreya means Buddha of the future. So he's not a Buddha, he's still in this earth, hence the jewelry, but you'll often see him with imagery that is like what we see on our historical Buddha print, Siddhartha Gautama. Okay, I'm going to take you to one other area today before I wrap up our mini lecture, and that is in Ajanta. This is an area in India shown here. Actually, you know what? I took out a map. I'm going to actually talk about Sarnath as well. A new era, a new culture developed called the Gupta. And in the Gupta era, we have rock-cut halls. And this is something we'll see in Karle, India. I'll show that to you on the map when we go back. And rock-cut halls then extend to places like Ajanta and other places. But this is what it looks like. This is a colored-in print from 1879. This is basically just this huge cliff. And there's an entrance to that cliff, and you can see a drawing of it here. And this is just a rock-cut temple. Like they literally just cut right into the bedrock of the earth, and everything you see here is cut right from the bedrock of the earth. That's what it looks like on the inside. This is a stupa. And so just like on that stupa at Sanchi, where people could circumambulate it, this stupa, people can also circumambulate. This is this long hall. It's 45 feet wide by 125 feet deep. And I just want to mention this one thing real quickly. If you've taken an art history Western class in the past and you've talked about religious structures, like the Gothic cathedrals, let's say, of the medieval era in Europe, something happens when you walk into those large structures. The sound, the lighting, the smell, the temperature, the dampness, the humidity, these are all things that change from the outside world. And in Christianity, that was used at various times in order to sort of promote this idea that you're entering into this otherworldly sacred space. And I think that that also happens in these rock-cut temples. These are called chaitya halls, and that's the word for it right here. I'll circle it so you can see it. Along this main walkway, you have columns, again, cut right from the bedrock of the earth, with Mithuna figures up top. So those are called Mithuna figures. They're amorous couples, men and women. Again, that sensual body of the female is depicted here. In this case, they reflect harmony and fertility. So fertility is really a theme that comes up a lot in India. Okay, now I'm going to Sarnath. So I want to quickly talk about Sarnath in the Gupta era. So around 320, and this is the Common Era, a new empire arose in what we call northern or central India. And so we call that Gupta. And this is the capital, Sarnath. So you see that here. Now this is actually where Buddha was thought to have given his first sermon. But what happens with images of Buddha at Sarnath is he becomes smooth. So instead of seeing those lines, for example, that we saw on the images from Mathura, right? Those abstract lines of fabric, or the draping, like the Greco-Roman drapery, instead of that, we see a plain simplicity, smoothness to his body. That smoothness is meant to reflect his spiritual purity. So his physical purity now is represented through, or his spiritual purity is represented through his physical purity. Okay, he is clothed, by the way, just if you're wondering. There are the hems of the garment shown here, and then just a little bit off of his body, but a little bit of that decoration there. You might notice the symbols we've already discussed as well. Now we're moving to Ajanta. Okay, so here's Ajanta, and these are caves. These are actually rock-cut caves, and we have some chatur halls here. We also have some monastic residences. We also have some Hindu temples. Hinduism develops as well alongside Buddhism, but to keep them separate, we're just discussing Buddhism today. The monks, many monks lived here, and this goes along with the idea that some who follow Buddhism believe you have to go live a life of like an ascetic, or live away from the complexities of the living world, right? So they live in these secluded areas, and this is quite secluded. I mean, you have these steps to these little rock cut either chachas or areas where monks lived, and then that's it. Then it's like a valley into the river, right? So it's really interestingly where it's depicted, and you just can imagine the amount of work that went into building these caves. These are the multiple caves that have been identified, by the way. This is like a bird's eye view of the river, and then the various caves and the structures that have been cut right into the bedrock. But what I want you guys to know, what's really important about Ajanta, because these caves, because they're cut right into the bedrock of the earth, early paintings from like the turn of the century survive. That is so rare to have paintings survive from this time period, not only in like even the Greco-Roman world, but in the type of climate of India. These paintings are not something that survived for a long time. So it's really quite a remarkable thing that we see these early paintings. What we see here is, by the way, part of a chakra wheel. So using that symbol of Buddha and turning the wheel of the law. In the Ajanta caves, we also see the Gupta style. That's that smooth style. So this is a chacha, a rock-cut hall. And then we have an image of Buddha. He's standing, but he's also very pure. Again, spiritual purity is fused with physical purity. And then more paintings. This is the Bodhisattva. Bodhisattva, again, is a Buddha of the future. Here, this Bodhisattva is adorned with a headdress. You see earrings. Here, this has been restored a little bit, but the colors and that intensity of the colors is really quite remarkable. Again, Ajanta is known for its colored painting. It's kind of a big deal. And then this is a wall painting, which you can see has fallen apart quite a bit. And this is a Jataka tale about a ruler who gave away to a neighboring city a rain-bringing elephant. His people got rid of him. They didn't want this particular ruler as a ruler because he gave away the rain-bringing elephant, and so he was banished from the city. Eventually, he was forgiven and he was brought back to the city, and you can see over here on the right-hand side that he's with his wife. Now, one last thing I do want to mention. In your book, there's a discussion on Jainism. Jainism is another one of these religions that follows the idea of samsara. Now, we'll see these Jainas look like this, okay? And these are those individuals associated with Jainism. And they go back millions of years in history, by the way. This is Mahavira. I think he was the 24th Jaina. There's a symbol on his chest. This is an auspicious symbol. But otherwise, he's nude. And in truth, he really looks disembodied. Here's a standing one. Let me show you the standing one. This probably looks a little bit more clearer. With these really long arms and his face, It's like he's not looking at you. He's not paying attention to you. He is not concerned about you at all. Like where Buddha figure was giving the hand gesture, like come forward, fear not, some of those mudras, for example, the mudras sort of speak to the viewer in Buddhism. Our Jina figures do not do that because when they achieve enlightenment, they become their own. They're in the other world. They are not around for you. They're for themselves. Now, I will tell you there's this interesting series by, I know, I'm going to say it, Oprah Winfrey called Believe. And there are a couple little videos you can find online, which you might find Jainism fascinating if you want to watch the episode online. I think you might be able to find just on her website if you look up Belief. I think it's Believe or Beliefs. Look up Jainism Oprah, Google that, see if you can find, it's like a 3-minute video where this guy breaks down really quickly Jainism. He also breaks down Hinduism and Buddhism in other videos, so definitely check that out. Otherwise, this is the end of our lecture today. Remember, read the textbook. This lecture that I'm giving you here in my presentation is not meant to be the only thing. You should be using your text. Your text is required in your assignments. You will need to cite any ideas taken from your sources, including your textbook. No plagiarism, even if it's unintentional. If you commit plagiarism, you are going to receive a 0 on that assignment. But as long as you do what you're supposed to do, cite any ideas that are not your own. I do want to see independent conclusions. That's really important. That's the final part of the assignments is you have to make some conclusions. It's not about being right or wrong, but it's about using what you've learned, having some support with your cited material, and then providing your ideas. And then, of course, most importantly, have fun. India's fun, awesome, great. And so really enjoy this early India section of our art history class. If you have any questions, you guys know where to find me, email, or reach out to me in the classroom. Okay, thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.